The account of Major Bull's troop of heavy 5.5-inch howitzers, written by Captain and Brevet Major R. Bull, Royal Horse Artillery. To Lieutenant Colonel Sir Augustus Fraser, KCB, commanding Royal Horse Artillery, June the 24th, 1815. Sir, having received your directions through Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald to render a report of the manner in which the troop of horse artillery under my command was employed during the battle of the 18th instant, I beg to inform you we were ordered from our bivouac at 8:30 a.m. and formed on the right flank of the heavy brigade of cavalry commanded by the late Major General Sir William Ponsonby, KCB, to the left of the road leading from Waterloo to Genappe, where we remained about an hour, when we moved by order of Lieutenant General the Earl of Uxbridge to the heights on the right of our first line, and immediately came into action with spherical case shot, with the intention of dislodging the enemy's infantry from the left of a small wood and the garden and the farm called Huguemont adjoining, and at about 1,000 yards distance from our front, in which I have reason to believe we succeeded, for our infantry were enabled to enter the wood. We then ceased firing for a few minutes by order of the commander of the forces on account of our troops occupying the wood, but on the enemy reinforcing it and again obliging them to retire, we recommenced our fire, and in a short time our infantry again entered it, reinforced by another regiment, when we directed our guns on some strong columns of infantry in rear and in support of the wood, with common and spherical shells, which immediately caused them to retrograde. The guns opposed to us at this time were about 16 in number, 12 in our front, and 4 on our right flank, beyond and above the before-mentioned farm, on the road to Lillois, and when we obliged their columns of infantry to move, they brought up 6 more guns in our front, all of which were well served, and annoyed us considerably. It was from one of these flanking guns that Major Cairns was unfortunately killed a few minutes after we got into our position. We continued in this situation, firing on their guns and columns until near 2 o'clock, when we ceased firing and received an order to retire the troop and form on the right of Major Ramsay's in the second line to enable us to repair our casualties and complete our ammunition. Whilst thus employed, Lieutenant Smith, 2 men and 2 horses were wounded. As soon as everything was completed, we moved forward with Major Ramsay's troop to resume our former position in the front line. But at that instant, the first charge of the enemy's cavalry took place against our first line, and we formed and got into action between the squares of infantry of the second line. As soon as their attack was repulsed, we again attempted to regain our former position, but the second charge of the enemy's cavalry took place at the instant of our getting up, and we had to prepare to defend ourselves with our swords from another situation on the side of the hill. But as the enemy's cavalry were again driven back, we followed them, and once more got into action on our original ground in front of the wood, but about 200 yards further advanced, Major Ramsay's troop firing on our left, from which position we maintained a most severe cannonade, as well as receiving the fire of the infantry from the column protecting the retreat of their cavalry, which latter, however, lasted but a short time. The guns on our right galling us extremely, I directed Lieutenant Lewis to turn his 2 guns towards them, and shortly succeeded in silencing them, which, as they enfiladed our position from the right, was of considerable advantage to us during the remainder of the day. About this time I myself was wounded, and from feeling much pain and losing a great deal of blood, I went to the rear to have my arm tied up. During my absence, about half an hour. Lieutenant Lewis maintained the same ground, and shortly after my return, the advance and attack of our army took place, and we advanced in support of them as far as the eligibility of the ground would admit. It was shortly after my return to the troop that some of my guns being short of ammunition, several of my men volunteered to assist Major Ramsey's guns on our left. The early part of the morning, our guns being directed against the wood, the natural effect could not be so well distinguished. But on inspecting the ground afterwards, it fully justified the opinion we had formed of it in the morning. The effect of our guns on the enemy's column was plain and decisive, and Major Ramsey on our left, who could see it more accurately than ourselves, sent me word that some of the shells opened a perfect lane through them. One in particular strewed the ground on the opposite side of the column. I have also reason to think our fire on their artillery had its effect, particularly on the two enfilading guns on our right. Our fire on their cavalry appeared to add considerably to their confusion whilst retiring. I believe I have now stated, as nearly as possible, the manner in which the troop under my command were employed during the whole period of the battle. We remained on the field until ordered to march at 3 p.m. on the 19th. On the conduct of the officers and men, I think it unnecessary to add more to the statement already given. In nothing could surpass their coolness and steadiness throughout the day, or their cheerfulness whenever called upon for particular exertion. I beg to add that the effect of the spherical shells generally appeared very great, and I observed but 2 shells out of the number fired that did not burst well. Robert Bull, commanding 1st Troop. Major E.C. Whinyates' troop of light 6-pounders and rockets. Colonel E.C. Whinyates, C.B., K.H., R.A. Brevet Major, Royal Horse Artillery. To Colonel Sir Hugh Ross, K.C.B., Deputy Adjutant General, Royal Artillery. Carlisle, March the 10th, 1841. When the bugles of the army sounded the turn out, my troop, with others of the horse artillery, assembled on the low ground behind the position on the left of the road leading to La Belle Alliance, and there awaited orders. The men were dismounted and stood near their horses. I was in front of my troop when I observed a stir. I was personally advanced before the line of cavalry, but not in its front, and watched with interest the general of cavalry making preparation. My troop was further back than the dragoons, but I should certainly say in their rear. I suddenly received a communication that the cavalry was going to advance, and that I was to move forward. The cavalry in all probability had the start, having been prepared before I received my order, and they certainly were across the Chemin Crans before us, as a hollow road with 2 banks and 2 hedges would require a little examination and consideration where and how to pass it with guns, and the greatest care to avoid accidents. At this moment, however, Colonel MacDonald of the Horse Artillery came up, and ordered me to leave my guns and advance with rocket sections, which I did, down the slope in front of the position, until the ground on the French side gave a more favourable chance of effectual rocket practice. In passing over this ground, there were no English or French dragoons, at least I saw none. There were a few French infantry soldiers lying about, and asking for quarter. When Colonel MacDonald ordered the advance with rockets, all the gun detachments, except the 2 dismounted men at each gun, who are called limber gunners, and which 2 are carried on the limbers and have no horses, left their guns behind them, and moved quickly down the slope in front of their guns. When halted and brought into action, they dismounted from their horses to fire ground rockets. that is, rockets not laid at angles of elevation, but rockets that ricocheted along the ground. There were crops of high-standing grain in front of the rocket sections when the men dismounted, which screened all objects in front, and the rockets were fired through them in the direction of the enemy's troops in position. And after firing some discharges of rockets, I received an order to rejoin the position. The troop accordingly moved back, steadily, and in perfect order, and unpursued, and rejoined their guns. I remember in going down the slope, I saw a guidon, or flag or colour, near a Frenchman, and though most anxious to get possession of it, I proceeded rapidly to come into action. I mention this to show that when the mind is intent and engrossed by such paramount duties, it is not likely that the observation can wander to that which is only of subsequent interest. The guidon was close to my horse's feet. According to my recollection of circumstances passed so long ago, the troop, from the moment of getting into motion, moved straight forward, clear of the cavalry, who were to my left. For I should not have advanced in rear of cavalry, when an open space was on their flank. For if they wanted my support, they would have masked my guns, or if checked, the dragoons would have been amongst and crippled us. It may, however, have inclined to the left or the right, actuated by circumstances of ground, or the position of troops in its way, or in nearing the hedge to convenient openings in it. For it may not have been parallel originally to the position. Events passed rapidly, and we did and occupied what seemed most advantageous and eligible. The high-growing corn through which we fired the rockets gave no indication that I am aware of cavalry having passed through it, and I never heard that the rockets went amongst the English dragoons, which I think I should have done, had the case been so. The cavalry must have been well engaged before any rockets were fired, but I cannot say that the dragoons were then retiring. Indeed, from the quickness with which everything was performed, I am led to think they were not, though they might have been. Colonel MacDonald might have seen them retiring. I did not. My opinion was that the foregoing transactions were from 1 to 2 hours earlier in the day. About 5 or 6 years ago, I was told that a major of English dragoons was left wounded near the French line, and that he had said he heard the rockets passing, and the French swearing in their way at them, and the English for wishing to burn them alive, and that they did not like them at all. I was with the troop in the same position from the beginning of the action until the total rout of the enemy, and having seen the day won, went to Mont Saint-Jean to have my wound examined, and was sent next morning to Brussels for cure.